Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'll be your host for this program. In today's program, we are going to look at the impact on Africa of European colonization. And with me, I have our special guest, Dr. David Harris from the University of Bradford. Dr. Harris is a senior lecturer in African Studies, which is a division of the Peace Studies and International Development at the University of Bradford. David, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Just to give our listeners a little bit more background, David, to yourself before we start. Dr. David Harris specializes in West African politics, in particular in Sierra Leone and Liberia, but also in the Gambia and the Ghana. His first book was published by IB Tauris in 2011, and a second book, Sierra Leone, A Political History, came out through Hearst Publishers, first in 2013 and then in an updated second edition in 2020. He teaches African and comparative politics and has also taught courses at King's College London, University of Nottingham, London Metropolitan University, and the Instituto Branco in Brasilia. He has worked on numerous election monitoring missions in Liberia and Sierra Leone for the Carter Center and NDI. He has also undertaken work for various European government departments and NGOs and written media pieces for Channel 4 and Fair Observer and African Arguments. He is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Sierra Leone Studies and external examiner at King's College London. So clearly, our special guest knows a lot about Africa and Europe as well. So before I get to David, just a little background to Africa and its importance. Africa is the world's second largest and second most populous continent after Asia. It covers 6% of the Earth's total surface area and 20% of its land area. With 1.3 billion people as of 2018, it accounts for about 16% of the world's human population. Despite a wide range of natural resources, Africa is the least wealthy continent per capita in part due to geographic impediments, often due to weak and unstable leadership, and importantly, because of the legacy of European colonization. Now, before we start our discussion on the relationship between Africa and Europe, I think it's important to remind our listeners that we humans owe a lot to the African continent. The story of modern human beings, or Homo sapiens, starts from Africa, with the earliest migrations out of Africa to other parts of the world over 125,000 years ago, and this number varies depending on researchers. Who knows what might be buried under the sands of the Sahara Desert? The African continent also gave us one of the earliest and greatest kingdoms of mankind, the Egyptians, who influenced so much of the Middle East and the Greeks of Europe. Egypt also added to the massive prosperity of the Roman Empire. Closer to the borders of southern Europe, the Carthaginians gave the Romans a run for their money, but in the end were savagely defeated and destroyed by an unforgiving Rome. Northern parts of Africa, bordering the Mediterranean, remained under the influence of rising Christian and Muslim powers, but within the main body of the African continent, there were many other less powerful kingdoms that had a proud history before modern-day European colonization. It is thought that prior to European colonialism, it is estimated that Africa had up to 10,000 different states and autonomous groups with distinct languages and customs. So, David, I hope that's an appropriate background to Africa and its importance. Before we start in the relationship between Africa, perhaps you could just tell us how Europe became to be such a dominant and major power in the world that expanded to the whole world, including Africa, just very briefly.
Thanks, Mohammed. This is a very big question, which is difficult to deal with briefly. But between the 16th and 20th century, the European states certainly did become very powerful globally. Historians talk about factors such as the development of the banking system, the industrialization process, even the geographical position of Europe, or the agendas of specific kingdoms and rulers, as Jared Diamond puts it, guns, germs and steel. But actually, I want to sort of dig a little bit more deeper than that, just for a second, and look at the ideas of Charles Tilley and Geoffrey Herbst. And they go They look at the ideas of how demography in Europe and Africa and how this had profound effects on state building, which of course comes underneath all of those other processes like the banking systems and the industrialization. What Charles Tilley says is that Europe was very densely populated, still is, which led to people rubbing up against each other. This led to conflict and the need to protect oneself and one's community. How do you protect yourself within such a densely populated place? Well, you need to give yourself some borders. You need to protect those borders. How do you protect those borders? Then you create, over time, a strong as possible state, a centralized state that can then have the wherewithal to protect those borders. How do you build a state? Well, you introduce taxation. How do you make sure that people pay their taxes? You try to bring them into the project and therein build a nation and nationalism. That's quite persuasive in many ways, but if we go across the Mediterranean to Africa, we see a completely different process going on. Large parts of Africa, even today, are sparsely populated. This is completely different from Europe. What this does then, according to Jeffrey Herbst, is to de-emphasize land and territory. Land becomes much less important because there's lots of it. Demarcating your territory becomes less important because, again, there is a lot of it. Further to that, then, the sparsely populated, the scattered people then become more difficult to control and to bring within the remit of a state. It indeed makes state formation quite costly because you've got such distances and such sparsely populated people. And this, Jeffrey Herbst argues, is why you don't get the sort of states you had in Europe in Africa. Yes, there were empires, as Mohammed pointed out, in Africa, but they were built on a different premise to the ones in Europe. I think finally the last thing to say would be that this idea of nationalism, which emerged in Europe quite organically in many ways, is not reflected in Africa. During the pre-colonial times, there were much more fluid ideas of identity. Unsurprising, really, when you don't need to build up that idea of a nation. So I think we're talking about two very, very different histories that comes from demography and geography. It's not the whole answer, but I think it's very important.
I think probably the biggest factor would be the really success of industrialization and the spirit of exploration. I mean, the early voyages clearly went all around the world and expansion started in many parts of the world. Africa was relatively later, though, compared to, say, contacts with India and the Far East, etc. When and why was Africa the focus of so many European powers? Can you tell us a little bit about the so-called Scramble for Africa? Because this is a particular period, isn't it, when Africa became divided amongst the European powers?
Yes, indeed. So we're talking about the 1880s here, which, as you say, is a very late colonialism. This is the last part of the world to experience European colonization. So up to that period, up to the 1880s, the presence of Europeans on the African continent was in very small coastal enclaves, with the exception of South Africa. These coastal enclaves were about trading. So the Europeans would have a foothold on the coast, and then they would trade with the Africans in all sorts of things, including, of course, slaves. But that was it. There was no interest when the Europeans didn't know what was inside the continent. They didn't really want to know. Their purpose was to trade, and so there was no great imperative to go and do anything more. But all this changed in the mid-1880s, and I'm going to talk about this shift of thinking in a minute, but it all came to a conclusion at the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, to which the Europeans European powers were all invited. No Africans were invited to this, and then it became known as the Scramble for Africa. I mean, it would have been sensible, really, because at the time there were some powerful empires in Africa, so you might say you would invite the Africans, but they certainly didn't get invited. So what then influenced this shift, this sudden real shift in thinking? Well, first of all, there's economic motivations. So this industrialization process, which was well underway in most parts of Europe. The argument here then is that this capitalist industrialization is based on a model where you expand and expand and expand. And so once you've expanded to everywhere else, you've got finally left one big continent. And so you expand into that as well. This process is that the industries need new resources and new markets, and so that kind of explains it. But I don't think that explains for us properly why it was then the 1880s that this happened. So I think we need to go a little bit further than that. So the second thing I'd mentioned is geopolitics, and as you mentioned, Bismarck has brought unified Germany. The Italians have unified in the Risorgimento, and you got this bigger sense of tension within Europe. Some people have argued that the expansion into Africa actually delayed the First World War by 20 years. Maybe so. But essentially what we're talking about here is a competition between states in Europe, which essentially gets exported into Africa.
I mean, it's fascinating, actually, because Europe had been at loggerheads and wars throughout. But here, when they divided Africa, it was through we will not fight each other, but we will carve it up. It was fascinating development.
It is true, yes, it is true. A third issue would be technology and weaponry. So this quinine has become available to deal with malaria, and so Sierra Leone can no longer be known as the white man's graveyard. Quinine has moved that on a bit, and they've got the Maxim machine gun, which had been tried and tested in the American Civil War. I think another point here would be less tangible motivations. There were some people who believed that it was the duty of more advanced nations to conquer and rule other nations for their own benefit. This was Cecil Rhodes who said that. I mean, we can debate all day long whether he meant it or not, but this was a push amongst various people within either government or church who insisted that, it was a good idea to export some idea of their idea, of course, of civilization and Christianity to Africa. I think the final thing to look at here would be African pressure as well, because some of these enclaves, European enclaves, came under attack from Africans, and for instance, in the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, the Ashanti were threatening many occasions the British enclaves, and the British then pushed back and took territory and essentially started that colonization process in a defensive kind of way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's believed that around 1870, 10% of Africa was under formal European control. And this increased to almost 90% by 1914, with only Ethiopia, which is Abyssinia, and Liberia remaining independent. So you can see, once the agreement had been reached, how rapidly Africa was conquered. Turning to the major powers then, David, what was the difference between the British, the French? I mean, there was about 7 European powers that carved up, as I understand, Africa. Firstly, how did they pick the different parts of Africa, and what were their crucial differences? If you could just take us through those different bits.
Yeah, sure. So the Berlin Conference allowed for well, it had two rules really. One was that any European power which had an enclave could then, on the coast, could then go inland in a straight line from that enclave and claim that territory. So that's how the different colonial powers then essentially picked their areas because they already had something on the coast. But the second thing that they said was that you had to demonstrate what they called effective occupation. But that was always very loosely defined, so that the onus wasn't to put in a big occupation force. It could actually be just down to a couple of administrators, and then you could claim that area. And I think what they were trying to get at here was, as you pointed out earlier, what they didn't want to do was fight amongst themselves. That was the last thing they wanted to do. And largely speaking, they succeeded in not fighting amongst themselves. And those rules were made to deliver that sort of result. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that, of course, if you go inland from all these coastal enclaves, you've got to meet at some point. And that problem was dealt with. I mean, that problem was the Congo, because the Congo is the big area of rainforest, mainly in the center of Africa. And the solution to that was provided, well, I say solution, I'll put that in inverted commas.
Yes.
And the solution was provided by the King of Belgium, who said, okay, I know you don't want to fight about this, and so what we can do is just give that to me. Give the Congo to me. And so the Congo...
King Leopold, yeah?
That's right. And it became his own personal fiefdom. But that suited the European powers. Yes, you asked about the difference between the different...
Which different sections of Africa they chose, or was there a preference, or just, you get dealt this and you get... I mean, clearly the British were a global power, so they probably wanted to pick very strategic parts of Africa for their global role, and others perhaps had different rationale. The
British did have an idea of that Cape to Cairo, but they never really achieved it. I mean, technically they did, but they never did much with it. But really, it was based on the presence in coastal enclaves. If you could say you got a coastal enclave, then you can go inland from there. That was, and in many ways, Portugal, which was a very poor country at the time, did have coastal enclaves and was able to use the same rules to claim significant parts of Africa, which really its status as the sick man of Europe at the time didn't really, you wouldn't think that Portugal would have done that. But yes, okay, so the difference between French and British rule, because France and Britain were two of the main powers here. The others, as you pointed out, there were 7. So you also had Germany, Spain, Italy,
Netherlands,
and Belgium.
Yeah.
But just to just go to the two of the key ones, France and Britain, they did have a different idea of how they wanted to exert their colonialism. So the French, they used what was termed direct rule. So the idea was that they would bring French administrators in large numbers, in theory anyway, to Africa, and they would administer everything themselves, right the way down into the little villages. So all the orders would come from Paris to the colonial capital out to the countryside, to the bush. That was the idea anyway. They had an idea of assimilation, so that Africans could, if they passed certain tests of education and language and Christianity, could assimilate and become French people. Not many did, but it could be done. And they also had an idea of this, what they called the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. France, of course, had been through all that turmoil of revolution, and had come out of the other side with these ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And they believed that, that's how people lived, and that's how people should live. And so those ideas were exported into their colonies. And what they saw, the French saw on the ground, was slavery, feudalism, ignorance, and disease. That's how they saw it. Of course, they weren't accurate in their observations. Feudalism didn't exist in Africa at the time, but that's how they saw it, and they saw of bringing those French values in. On the British side, they used something which was termed indirect rule. So they didn't bring lots of administrators and do all the administrating themselves. They had ideas based on what Lord Lugard did in northern Nigeria, and that was rule by proxy through the African political hierarchies who were there already. So the sultans and the chiefs and the kings who were there already. That's a completely different idea from what the French were trying to do. Indeed, equally, the British did not have any idea of assimilation. Africans were not going to become British. So there were considerable differences of the way they approached it. Now, the British also had ideas of a British civilization being superior to what was there in Africa as well, but they were less keen to interfere than the French were. There were some elements like slavery and female genital mutilation, which they, as Jodi Ali puts, found distasteful, but they were not going to interfere so much in African society as the French were. So there were some differences in that. But key here, I think, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, is that the amount of resources that any of these colonial powers put in was quite limited. And because they were quite limited, in the end, even when the French promised to send all their administrators, they didn't, because of the cost. And in effect, all of these colonial models edged towards the British one, i.e. working through the Africans who were leaders in their communities at the time.
Interestingly, I mean, one of the drivers, I suppose, was the need to expand territory and control and, exert power, because obviously all these European powers had big empires at that stage. But if you had additional countries that you governed, you could recruit more to the military, etc. But in relation to the resources, did they know from the start about the vastness of, things like diamonds, tin, copper, palm, cocoa, or was that really through exploration as they took control and thought, wow, Africa's got so many things?
Yes, they had very little idea at the Berlin Conference of what was in the interior. Very, very little idea. So, for instance, diamonds in Sierra Leone was discovered in the 1930s. Long time afterwards. So, no, They did not have that idea. No.
And whilst they set out initially, look, let's not have wars and conflicts with each other, did they at any stage get close to have any wars in governing and taking over Africa, or did they manage to stave off wars?
They managed. There was the Fashoda incident, but it was one amongst very little conflict between European powers. Very little indeed. In many ways, they succeeded in their mission to carve Africa up without fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah. And what was and we probably covered it in the second segment as well in relation to the African themselves and the states. Was there any major resistance put up to say, hang on a second, clearly some of the states were stronger than others, but was there any major resistance put up to European expansion and takeover? Or?
There certainly was, yes. So the Ashantis put up a considerable fight. They lost in the end. The Zulu kingdom.
This is in southern, which part? Is this in southern Africa?
Right. The Ashantis were in.
You're an expert, so I just want I just want our listeners to know roughly which part of Africa that covers.
Of course. The Ashantis were in the Gold Coast, which became Ghana in West Africa. Right. The Zulu kingdom in South Africa, they put up a considerable fight against the British intervention. But the one but again, they lost in the end, and that was a pattern which was in place in many countries. So in Sierra Leone, there was the Hut Tax War in 1890. In the mid-1890s, again, quite a resistance put up, but in the end they lost. So that was a pattern repeated endlessly across the continent, except in Ethiopia. And that's quite interesting. So at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, the Italians were pushed back by the Abyssinians, as they were at the time. And so Ethiopia, as it became, was, as you pointed out before, remained independent during the whole of this period, apart from that brief interlude when Mussolini sent Italian troops in for 5 years. It was an independent country. I think we can safely say was not colonized as such. But that's interesting again. I think, but why was Ethiopia able to resist? And we can talk about things like perhaps the Italians weren't as convincing militarily. We can talk about the emperor of Ethiopia having access to more guns. Sure, we can do all that. However, I think, again, going back to Geoffrey Herbst's arguments and Charles Tilley's argument, Ethiopia is a highland area and had intense agriculture and had state building for some time. It was quite densely populated, similar to Europe, and had that process of state formation, which is more similar to a concentrated, centralized, strong state. And if that's the reason, or whatever reason, they were able to resist the Italians.
This is probably a good place there to stop for our first segment. So we'll have a break and we'll be back in very shortly. Just a plea to our listeners, please do give us feedback on the Voice of Islam Living History programs, either through our website, which is www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and you can listen to our 35, 36 program, lost count now, lots of programs on world history, and also our Twitter hashtag, which is @VI Living History. So we look forward to your feedback. So David, thanks for this first segment, and we'll be back shortly. Allah, Allah.
You're listening to the Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting on DAB and via the internet 24 hours a day.
So welcome back. I've been talking to Dr. David Harris, an expert on African and European studies, and we were talking about the colonization of Africa by Europeans. So we talked about how Europe really became interested in Africa in the first segment, David. Let's turn to the sort of big question, because there's a lot of talk even in the current world affairs about Black Lives Matter and the whole history of colonization and slavery and all that. So I suppose the million-dollar question, was colonialism purely mercenary, extractive and overwhelming? There's two schools of thought, isn't there? So let's start with that first bit. And what do you think?
Sure. So this is a common perception of colonialism, that it was mercenary, it was extractive, it was done for the benefit of purely for the benefit of Europeans and their economies, and it was an overwhelming force. Now, of course, there's plenty of evidence to back those arguments up. I'm going to suggest it's not the only argument, but there are certainly there's evidence there. So, for instance, the fact that all those borders were put in place suggests it was a relatively overwhelming force. Equally, a lot of the transport infrastructure that was put in place was to benefit, was to actually take goods out of these territories and back to Europe. So you see that train lines go from the coast to plantations or to the mines. So again, this reflects European short-term strategic and economic interests. The coercion that was used against Africans, and we talked about a little bit about this in the first section, was used quite effectively, and pacification then, if we can call it that, was largely over by the early 1900s. So within 20 years, you've got European control, except to some extent in the Portuguese colonies, which continued to struggle to assert their authority. So if we look at authors like Crawford Young, he wrote a book about the Belgian Congo, and he describes a Congolese term, bulamatari, which translates as the crusher of rocks. And that was the way in which the colonials were caricatured in the Congo by Congolese. It suggests, of course, that this was a particularly strong, coercive, divisive, non-developmental and extractive colonial state. And the history of the Belgian Congo is not, is quite horrific in many ways.
I mean, even in the current state, you see Congo in absolute turmoil, don't you? So it's
you
been
do
a mess.
indeed. You do indeed.
Sorry,
and yeah, absolutely. But back in the days when the King Leopold was given the Congo, the stories that emerged from there were horrifying. The treatment of workers on plantations or in the mines, and people having their limbs chopped off and imprisoned, incarcerated, and killed. To the point where a lot of cocoa was coming out of Congo, and it was used to make chocolate by Cadbury's, Bourneville, these European companies who were Quaker owned. And the Quakers were bothered about this, and they sent their own investigator to the Belgian Congo, who came back with all these stories. The Quakers then published them around the world, and it became a scandal, a huge scandal, to the point that the Belgian government actually took the colony off the king, and it became a proper Belgian colony, not just a fiefdom of the king. And that was quite a considerable, well, it was a huge scandal of the times. But it points towards that idea of it being, of colonialism being extractive and mercenary. Bill Freund, another academic, said that the imperial conquest of Africa was undertaken to tap African resources in order to help resolve the economic problems of Europe. So that's quite clear, really. He said that until 1920, this was the era of forced taxation, forced cultivation, forced labour, often company rule. So effectively then what we're talking about here then is an idea of very strong colonial powers who were able to have their own way vis-a-vis Africans, and were in that for their own, for the benefits of Europe. Now, I think crucially with this argument, what we're looking at here is a huge rupture in history on the African continent. If we take this point of view in its entirety, this is a huge change. In other words, history changes direction quite considerably. The problem with this model is that there's no Africans in it. The Africans appear to be merely victims. And that, to me, makes it suspicious. I'm not going to say that there isn't plenty of evidence, there is, but it's neglecting the African angle to this. Were they doing nothing? Were they just sitting back and being victims? I don't think that is the case. That's where I think there is a problem with just that point of view.
I mean, obviously, there were resources, vast resources in natural resources. But of course, the manpower and the human cost was enormous. If you look at the Atlantic slave trade, so many Africans. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that had been going on for many centuries before the Berlin Conference, etc. But how did the numbers match, and what's your feeling in terms of what happened and how it happened? And eventually, of course, we had the abolition of slavery, but just your comments.
Well, all of these colonial powers, what were to become the colonial powers, had been involved in the slave trade. But by the time you get to the Berlin Conference, all of the powers had actually, abolished it. And indeed, British and French ships would, up to the very end, would intercept Spanish and Portuguese ships and take the slaves off them and bring them back to the African continent. So there's been a shift in thinking by the time you get to the Berlin Conference. However, the effects of slavery, well, we're feeling those even now, as you pointed out earlier on. But at the time, I would say there were several effects. One is the further depopulation of Africa. So, as I was saying before, it's quite sparsely populated, and in some areas becomes even more sparsely populated. But the second one was that this was quite a trade, and it's not just the Europeans involved, it is Africans as well. So Africans would take other Africans and deliver them and sell them to the Europeans, who would then take them to the Americas. That trade then was stopped, or over a period of a few decades was stopped, and so various empires within Africa waxed and waned based on how they were on their dealings with the slave trade, and whether they were able to move to other trades other than the slave trade afterwards. So it had quite an effect on, I guess, the political environment within Africa as well.
I think, as you said, that over time, as the Europeans started realizing the vast natural resources, they probably moved on from the early slave trade. And,
oh, yes.
Shipping people off to different parts of the world to actually extracting the natural resources and building on that.
Beyond that, the British and the French and all the colonial powers were very keen to stamp out any idea of slavery within the African continent. Now, we'd have to separate this out a bit, because the idea of transporting across people across the ocean is a completely different one from an idea of domestic slavery, which existed on the African continent itself. Two very different things altogether. One utterly horrendous, and the other much more nuanced as an idea, more like servitude rather than slavery, if we can make that distinction.
Let's turn to the other argument then. Some European authors obviously present the role of Europe as a modernizing force for Africa, etc., and to other parts of the world as well, in India and Pakistan, where I come from. So what are your thoughts about this interpretation? We should deal with both of them, I think, fairly so.
Absolutely. So it has been, Niall Ferguson particularly recently has pointed to the benefits of colonialism. I don't want to suggest this is a benefit, actually. Yes, we can portray it as a modernizing force. I think more accurately it will be a westernizing force. So you get the introduction of infrastructure, you get the introduction of some industries, you get the introduction of Western education. That's not to suggest there wasn't education there before, but you get Western education instead, and of course health in terms of hospitals and clinics and such. We'd have to say all of that was very limited, very, very limited. Perhaps on top of that, we'd have to say, okay, there's the introduction of the modern European state form. So demarcated territory, centralized structures, a permanent coercive force, a permanent bureaucracy, national taxation, codified laws. That was introduced. Now, some of the empires in Africa had some of those elements beforehand, but the European state developed in Europe had all these elements as part of it, or supposed to be part of it. They were exported lock, stock and barrel. So that is a change. That's we could call a modernizing force. And it is important because that's the way the world runs now. The UN recognizes countries based on whether they fit into this category or not. And so that is important to think about anyway. What was I going to say? Oh, yes. So there was also these ideas of social modernization, or perhaps even socio-cultural evolution. So there was a thinking of the time was that all peoples around the world gradually evolve and civilize. Now, of course, this is largely debunked as an idea now, but at the time, it was thought that, the French thought that they'd reached the peak of civilization, the British did the same, etc., etc., and they were exporting these ideas to Africa so that Africans would modernize in the same way. Highly problematic, of course, but that was a lot of the thinking of the time. I think I'd like to say just one more thing about this, and that is the idea of ethnicity and traditional leaders. Now, you would think if you were exporting a model of African society and government, you'd want to get rid of those things. And indeed, the French did want to get rid of those things, but the British didn't. And in the end, as I said before, a lot of these colonists ended up with much more like a British model. And so what they did with ethnicity and traditional leaders was they codified them. They put them they categorized them in a very sort of manner of the late 19th, early 20th century in trying to categorize and codify everything. And they came within that banner as well. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it started to set in stone some of these identities, these subnational identities and these traditional leaders, whereas previously they've been much more fluid. It also began to politicize them. As John Iliff said, Europeans believed Africans belonged to tribes. Africans built tribes to belong to. Because if you're going to face up to the colonial power, you might as well do it from a position of bigger numbers. So you bring people together under one banner, as in an ethnic group, which the colonial powers then recognize. And then that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. Just a final thing to say about this then is that if we look at it from this particular viewpoint, the importation of the European state and ideals and norms, if we look at it from that point of view, this again shows colonialism as a big rupture in history. It's a big shift in the way that things are done, a big shift in the way that Africa is governed and how Africans live. There's more African agency in this model. We've talked a little bit about Africans, what they did in this, but it's still, the problem for me is it's still not dealing with that African response.
So, David, I want to move on next to the question that was colonialism a 70-year-old blip in the overall and long-term African history? In a sense, did the Europeans really change or affect or restrict the African development? Before I go to that, just one more question. In the current academic world, a lot of controversy and debate about people like Cecil, Rhodes, and the other chap in Bristol whose statue was
Colston.
Yeah, I mean, these are some big figures and big debates in academia going on with this various, even Gandhi statues being questioned in certain universities. But your own thoughts about these big figures and how one should interpret all this? What do you think?
Clearly, Colston, Rhodes were involved. Of course they were, and benefited from it, most definitely. If it's a case of whether we should be pulling down the statues or contextualizing them, I I understand why people would want to pull them down, and of course that makes big media headlines and potentially gets things done. However, I think contextualizing them would be a much better service to history, so that we can see them. Perhaps we move them to somewhere else, fine, but we keep them and we contextualize them. We say, look, this is what this person did. These are the things that they did, which you might regard as positive, and these are the things you might regard as horrendous. Let's have that debate in the public space.
I tend to agree with you, David, because I think it's important knowing what happened, how it happened, and what lessons can be learned.
Exactly.
And move on. And I think this was central to what, a great figure like Nelson Mandela believed as well about understanding and not repeating the mistakes, but forgiving and moving on. So let's get back to my question instead of then Africa and its development. Do you think without the Europeans, Africa may have had a different direction? Take us through, because we know very little about Africa and its actually heritage and development, apart from what's taught from the Muslim writers from their, their history, and the European writers from theirs. So just tell us a little bit about how Africa was doing and how it could have done without the Europeans.
Well, before I get to that question, because that's a counterfactual question, which is very, very tricky to answer. But if I go through this idea of colonialism not being this huge rupture in history, it kind of gets towards that, towards an answer to that question. So the third way of looking at colonialism, I think, is to consider it to be not the great rupture in history that many people paint it as. Indeed, is there actually more continuity than change? And so this way of thinking started to emerge probably in the 1980s, 1990s, and is still with us. And it's based on the idea that that the amount of resources that the colonials put into the colonial project in Africa was remarkably restricted. This was what many people have said, it was administration on the cheap. Samuel DiCarlo said that 60 years of colonial rule in Chad, that's in Central Africa, did not effect any major changes. Jeffrey Herbst said that the colonists were neither administrators nor conquerors. And Sarah Berry said that this was hegemony on a shoestring. In other words, this was not serious colonialism. And I want to give you a quick example, a comparison. In the 1930s, in British West Africa, which is Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone and the Gambia, there were only 1,220 British administrators. That was it. In French West Africa, which is a huge area, there were 3,660 French administrators. So, as we can see, the French took more, but it's still not many. And the comparison I want to make is with Japan. So Japanese colonialism in Korea, in the 1930s, there were approximately 45,000 Japanese administrators. So many, many, many times more. That was serious colonialism. What the British and the French were doing was, in many ways, light touch. Now, the question then, of course, is how did they do it? And the thinking here is that it goes back to those relationships with the African leaders of the time. So the colonials would go in and they would make deals with the local hierarchy, political hierarchies, the chiefs and the sultans, etc. And even the French did this, even though they said they didn't. And they would then form these alliances. And for the African leaders, this was actually quite beneficial to them if they formed an alliance with say the British against some their enemies, whoever they might be. And so in some ways you could see that was a strategic calculation, and the colonials would exploit that. And so the amount of coercion, military force that was used was minimized, and this deal making, these negotiations were put forward as the main way of doing things. So then you can then rule through the African leaders. Yes, of course, you've got the ultimate coercion there, but the main thing is to have that negotiated process. Thomas Spear said that this was mutual attraction and working misunderstandings. If we take this point of view, then what we're talking about is a very truncated period of colonialism. This was only 60 or 70 years. It's not long in the centuries and centuries of history. And it goes to show that even all the stuff they said they were going to do, the colonials, and what we've talked about, actually, they didn't do a lot of it. And even if we go down to like the extractive side of it, yes, there were parts of Africa like where the plantations and the mines were, which were heavily affected, but the rest hardly affected at all. So in other words, there's an imbalance in how the colonials dealt with these colonies. As Samuel de Carlo says, nothing happened in Chad because there were very limited numbers of plantations and very limited mining activities. So if we take this seriously, then what we're talking about here is not a rupture in history, but a continuity. So people at the local level, particularly in the rural areas, and most people lived in rural areas, they're still living with their leaders of the time. They still exist. Okay, so they're part of the colonial hierarchy now, but they're still there, and they continue to live much as they have done before, and very little has changed. People wouldn't see these colonial administrators because they weren't there. Now, I'm not trying to say that nothing changed. No, of course not. But in many parts of the way that people lived and governed themselves and worked didn't change. And so what we then see is a much different interpretation of what colonialism did. Ultimately, then, the coercion, the modernization, the capitalism did little to fundamentally reshape the social orders and the governance within local African society.
Clearly, as the sort of First World War and Second World War drew on, it drained European powers, and many states started getting independence. What would you say the overall then legacy of European colonization in Africa has been? Well, how should we interpret it or see it for our future generations?
Well, I think it's worth me saying then, out of those three interpretations or viewpoints I've tried to give you, which one is, if you come to me and say which one is correct, I would say all three. I would say
yes.
that all three can coexist at the same time. And I think it depends where you go. So if you went to the Belgian Congo, or the DRC as it's known now, you would say that maybe you're going towards a more extractive model. But if you went to Chad or Guinea-Bissau or Djibouti or somewhere like Somalia, you would perhaps then say it's more towards that sort of continuity. And less extractive, or less a lighter footprint overall. So I think you can see all of these together. But I think the main point I would want to make here is whichever way you look at this, none of these are beneficial. None of them at all. So it's obvious how the extractive and coercive one is not beneficial. Even if you come down to this idea of exporting European ideals, it creates a two-tier system. And if you look at the idea that colonialism was pretty unimpressive in most of what it was trying to do, then it's not setting up an establishment or a state or a way of doing. And again, what we're getting here then is a two-tier system, and that is what many of the scholars think about when they're talking about the legacy now. They talk, so for instance, Mahmoud Mamdani talks about a bifurcated state. In other words, you've got your modern state, which was imported under colonialism and continues to exist in the post-colonial state, but you've got all of the chiefs and the sultans, etc., in the countryside, who continue to be a force. And so you've got that two-tier system. Peter Ecke talked about the two publics. In other words, you've got a civic public in the capital, and then you've got a local public within the countryside, or indeed within the towns. I think Joel Migdal captured this quite nicely when he talked about the development of the strong society and weak state. So this colonial state, which was deficient, under-resourced, but has landed. That's your weak state in the post-colonial times, but you've still got a very strong society. You've got people who are still, the legitimacy lies with local leaders, and so you've got a very an organised, a strong basis to society, but a weak state on top of that. And that kind of gets back to what you were saying at the very start about how the post-colonial state in Africa has struggled all along to try and assert itself on its own people and to actually develop, shall we say.
David, we've reached the end of our slot, so thank you so much. I found this a really enlightening discussion. I hope our listeners will have as well. So we've been talking to Dr. David Harris from the University of Bradford. I think just in conclusion, I said at the start that we have a lot to thank Africa for. And that goes back to our very origins as human beings. But in the modern world, from Africa, a black man came to be the president of the greatest power on earth at the moment, the United States, Barack Obama. Just think about it. His forefathers could never have imagined it. One of the greatest figures across the whole globe, Muhammad Ali, a black man as well, one of the greatest boxers alive, again, whose origins I'm sure you can retrace to somewhere in Africa as well. And in my view, one of the greatest political figures of our modern time, Nelson Mandela from South Africa. What a figure, what an amazing person. So there's a lot of hope for Africa, I think. So David, thank you for enlightening us about Africa and its relationship with Europe. Thank you once again.
It was a pleasure.
So again, a plea to our listeners, please do give us your feedback on our hashtag #VILivingHistory, @VILivingHistory, and also visit the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk and listen to our programs. You will love them, truly. I hope you will like them. So until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.